One of the best stories of the NFL season is the will they, won't they Cincinnati Bengals. Never say die. They are still alive. Joining us here on Watch DA Live is a good friend of ours. You've heard him on the radio with me a number of times throughout the years. Joining us is the voice of the Bengals and UC Cincinnati basketball and football, Dan Hoard. Dan, how you doing?
DA, I'm awesome. How are you?
Doing great. I mean, this Bengals team plays some amazingly crazy games. Saturday was nothing different. The way that this thing ended, what was the vibe in the locker room? What was the vibe following the game of another insane Bengals victory?
I asked several players after the game if it was the craziest game they had ever played in, and the consensus was, well, maybe it's not number one, but it's definitely in the top three. It was definitely one of those games. There were various moments where you're like, they won. 5 minutes later, they've lost. 5 minutes after that, they won again. So it was one of those days in a season that's been like that for Cincinnati. And thankfully, we don't have to start talking about the draft or free agency just yet because they've still got a shot at going to the postseason.
We saw the head coach of the Bengals, Zach Taylor, say nobody on the planet is playing football better than Joe Burrow is right now. Would you agree?
I would agree. There's never been an MVP in the NFL from a team with a losing record. It's obviously happened in Major League Baseball several times, but it's never happened in the NFL. Joe Burrow would make a serious case for it to happen this year. I don't think it's going to. I think Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen or maybe Saquon Barkley will win. But Joe Burrow has been more valuable, if you go by that definition, more valuable to his team than anybody else. I think you'd have a hard time picking anybody other than Joe.
What is his mentality like? I mean, we saw the shots of the sideline after the last-second touchdown, which tied it up. After the missed field goal, it almost was like his soul was leaving his body. Like, I got to do this again. Found a way to win, but what is his attitude been like behind the scenes?
You know, it's interesting with Joe because he doesn't have a waking moment where there's not a camera on him. So you see every emotion that he goes through. And there was a moment a few weeks ago when the Bengals won a road game at Tennessee. The game was in hand and Joe was more or less freaking out on the sideline. He was face to face with Zach Taylor. A lot of people interpreted that as some sort of disagreement between player and coach. And it wasn't that at all. It was Joe having the ultimate high standard and just being disappointed with the mistakes that the Bengals made in that game. So that's Joe Burrow. He is a perfectionist. He is playing close to perfect in recent weeks this year. And that is the biggest reason why the Bengals still have at least a puncher's shot of going to Buffalo in round one of the playoffs.
One can only imagine that when you play as sublime football as he is playing and you might miss the playoffs or might finish below 500, you would have every right to be frustrated with what's happening around you. We don't know if that's the truth. Do you have any sense of whether he is frustrated by some of the shortcomings of this season?
Of course he is. But when you say that, people jump to the conclusion that he's angry at the organization. He's going to want out, something along those lines. There's nothing like that going on, but of course he's frustrated. They've had multiple games this year where they've scored 33 or more points and lost. A record number of games like that this season. They've scored 30 or more points in half of their games, 8 out of 16, and they're 500. So yes, he is definitely frustrated that they don't have a better record, that they are not competing for the number one seed instead of the 7th and final playoff spot and needing help to get there. But frustrated is very different from angry. And I think frustrated is the right word.
So give us the nuts and bolts of why the Bengals have been unable to take advantage of this MVP caliber season of Burrow. Is it the defensive lapses? Is it special teams lapses? Is it coaching flaws? What is going on?
It's the defense. It's no mystery. This defense has been ranked in the bottom 4 of the NFL all year in points allowed, in stopping the run, and all of the significant metrics. I mentioned a moment ago that they've had a bunch of games where they've scored 33 or more and lost. That just doesn't happen in the NFL. It's only happened to 2 other teams this year. It's happened to the Bengals 4 times this year. So yes, it's a defensive issue. largely up front. I think their defensive line, other than Trey Hendrickson, has really underperformed. There have been some injuries. They haven't had Sheldon Rankins much. Sam Hubbard was hurt in training camp. He's been a shell of his former self. They've tried to play some younger guys, and it's taken those guys a while to start playing well. But it really is as simple as the offense is fantastic, and the defense just has not been good enough.
How many changes should we expect to see on the defense of the offseason, no matter how the season ends, coaching staff-wise and personnel-wise?
There will definitely be changes. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of the coaching staff. I think the Bengals front office will let this season play out and then evaluate everybody on both sides of the ball to try to decide what they're going to do going forward. Anytime that a team falls short of expectations, and let's face it, the Bengals were considered one of the Super Bowl favorites going into the year, an organization makes changes, but I'm in no position to predict what those changes are going to be.
Do you think Joe Burrow's happy with Zach Taylor?
I think he loves Zach Taylor. A few weeks ago, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase that Joe Burrow used, but he was asked about the Bengals coaching staff. This was 2 weeks ago, and the words he used were a marriage made in heaven. That sounds like somebody who likes his head coach, his offensive coordinator, Dan Pitcher, his former offensive coordinator, Brian Callahan, who's now the head coach of the Tennessee Titans. So yes, Zach and Joe have a great relationship. There is no problem between those two.
Is there a way that T. Higgins comes back next season?
That is the biggest question right now in Cincinnati, because I would have said pretty much all season long that they will not bring back T. Higgins. And I think most Bengals fans were under that assumption as well. They will extend Jamar Chase. They'll pay him whatever it takes to make sure that he's locked down for the future. And I think a lot of people assume, all right, if you're paying Joe Burrow $55 million and you're going to be paying Jamar Chase as much as any wide receiver in the NFL, it's hard to then go ahead and pay T. Higgins too. But in the postgame, after the Bengals won in Dallas, Joe Burrow kind of out of nowhere said, I think we've got a chance to bring T. Higgins back. He sounded confident that the Bengals were going to be able to do it. A few days later, in a pre-game news conference, one of his midweek news conferences, somebody followed up with a question and said, is it a need to bring T. Higgins back? And Joe Burrow said, yes. So if Joe Burrow wants T. Higgins back that badly, the front office is going to try to accommodate him. Now, does that guarantee he'll be back? No, because another organization could make a crazy offer that the Bengals just can't match. But if T wants to be back, I think Joe would be perfectly willing to restructure his contract to try and make it happen. I think the Bengals would probably be willing to pay T as much as any number 2 wide receiver in the NFL. It's just a question of whether that's going to be enough for T to stick around.
If the Bengals somehow maneuver their way into the postseason, I can't imagine any team would want to play them because of the way that Burrow is clicking, because of the way him, Chase, and Higgins are clicking. And a potential first-round matchup could be going to Buffalo, where the Bengals won a couple of years ago in the playoffs. And so if the Bengals did find a way in, do we have to consider them a very live contender in the AFC?
No doubt about it. This offense is playing as well as any in the NFL. The defense is playing better, not great, but better. Now, in fairness, they haven't exactly faced a murderer's row of quarterbacks in recent weeks. Bo Nix has had an excellent season, and they beat him on Saturday. But prior to that, it was Cooper Rush in Dallas, Will Levis and Mason Rudolph in Tennessee, Dorian Thompson-Robinson with Cleveland. So again, not the greatest run of quarterbacks, but this offense alone is enough to put a scare into any team in the postseason. And not only did the Bengals win a playoff game in Buffalo a few years ago, but they've kind of had the Bills' number. They beat them last year in primetime in Cincinnati. The game wasn't as close as the final score indicated. So I'm sure that's a team that Buffalo, as well as the Bills are playing, they would prefer not to face Joe Burrow in Cincinnati.
What is it about Joe this season that has put him at that next level? I mean, he's been great for a long time, but it just feels like this year he's playing at such a high level, even compared to his standards. What are you seeing that's unique?
It's the ability to make great throws on the run. He's done that at times in the past. He's doing that on a weekly basis now. He's always been fantastic from the pocket. He's always been able to scramble for first downs when that's been needed. But this year, when he takes off, he throws strikes on the move, running forward, running left, running right. It's incredible how accurate he's been on the run, how much velocity he's gotten onto those throws on the run. So that's been the thing that he's added to what was already a package that was among the best of any quarterback in the league.
You know, the Bengals are the only team that's ever beaten Patrick Mahomes in the AFC playoffs and didn't need a fluke to do so, because the Patriots did so, but Dee Ford was lined up off sides. If he's lined up on sides, the Patriots don't beat him. The only team that it did it head-to-head, helmet-to-helmet, was the Bengals AFC Championship game in 2021. I'm not sure you can say they have the recipe, but what does it take to beat the Chiefs at Arrowhead, which somebody is going to be tasked with doing again this year?
The Bengals did it, as you pointed out, in the AFC Championship game in 2021. The following year, in the AFC Championship game, the Chiefs won on a walk-off field goal. The Bengals had the ball late in the game with a chance to take the lead, and that was a rare instance where Joe Burrow did not deliver. This year, in week 2 at Arrowhead, the Bengals seemingly had the game won before they committed a silly penalty with 40 seconds to go on 4th and 16, or they beat the Chiefs in Arrowhead this year. It's hard to explain, but the Bengals, for whatever reason, match up better with Kansas City than anybody else. The Bengals defense definitely plays better against Kansas City than they play against any other contending team that they face on a regular basis. And as a result, they have a lot of confidence when they go head-to-head with KC. At one point, Burrow had a 3-game winning streak against Patrick Mahomes. So there's no guarantee they're going to get there. They might not even make the playoffs, but if those two teams meet in Arrowhead, Cincinnati will go into that game feeling very comfortable that they've got a chance to win.
On the 4th down touchdown by the Broncos to tie things up at the end of the game, with the doink off of the post by Cade York, we saw Joe Burrow's his attitude again look like, what are we doing here? What did you look like in the booth as those things unfolded?
I think most announcers now, they have a booth cam, so their video of this probably exists somewhere at Paycor Stadium. I'm sure it was similar to Joe. We were definitely, grabbing our head and doing things like that and wondering, oh no, is this game somehow slipping through their fingertips? Thankfully, that's not the way this one turned out, because it has been a season filled with losses like that. There are 5 games that came down to one play where the Bengals failed to make the play all 5 times. Kansas City was one of those games in week 2. There was the Baltimore overtime game where they botched the hold for an overtime field goal, or they win that game. They go for 2 at the end of the road Baltimore game. If they get it, they win. There are several penalties that weren't called on the play. That one went against Cincinnati. So it's been one of those years. It was fun to win a game like that on Saturday. And again, it's great to at least have a puncher's chance with 1 week to go.
Well, before we let you go, a big honor recently as you were honored by our fellow alumni, the Newhouse School at Syracuse, for the Marty Glickman Award. Glickman was a legend. This is for leadership in sports media. Nobody more deserving than you. That must have been a lot of fun. Introduced as well by your friend Sean McDonough. That must have been a cool thing.
It was tremendous. DA, it's the classic case of what name does not belong on this list. I mean, you've got Marv Albert, Bob Costas, Mike Tirico, Sean McDonough, Beth Mullins, Ian Eagle. What the heck am I doing on that list? But I'm certainly not going to turn it down. It was the honor of a lifetime. It was so great to be back at our alma mater. I hadn't been back on campus in several years. My wife is also a Syracuse grad. She came with me to the event, and we both said afterward, we need to get back to the Cuse more often, because it was so much fun to be back on campus. And you know this, when you're back at your alma mater, you feel young again. It's just the energy of having been there back in those days. I felt like I was 30 years younger. And that in and of itself is a reason to get back to the Cuse.
Now there's a football team that's pretty good as well, just wrapping up a 10-win season the other day. So that was cool to see as well.
Thanks to a former Bengal. Fran Brown played for the Bengals, so there's a great tie there.
That's a good one. Well, you're too self-deprecating. You're absolutely deserving of that honor. I was so glad to see you honored and awarded with that the other day. Thanks so much, as always. Dan Hoard is the voice of the Cincinnati Bengals, as well as Cincinnati basketball and football, and he joins us here on the show. Always good to catch up, Dan. We appreciate it very much.
Likewise, DA. Thanks for the invitation.